Welcome, class, to the Intro to Java Programming. This is the third of 3 lessons on looping statements. In this lesson, we will review the do while and while loops along with a visual example, the syntax, and some code examples. Often, you will be in a situation where you need to execute a set of code multiple times until a specific condition is met. There are 4 types of looping statements that will accomplish this task. In this lesson, we will cover the do while and while loops. If you recall from lesson 24, the standard for loop is used when you know the exact number of iterations a block of code will be executed. And from lesson 25, the enhanced for loop is used when iterating over a collection like an array, arraylist, set, or map. The do while and while loops will be used when a block of code needs to be executed an undetermined number of times. Sure, here's one example. Imagine I pick a number from 1 to 10. And you need to guess that number. I will respond with correct, higher, or lower. If you guess correctly, the game is over. How many guesses will you need? You could get the number on the first try. You might need 10 guesses. It's unlikely, but possible that you could take more than 10 guesses. These 2 actions will be repeated an unknown number of times. Let's look at the do while loop first. Using the pick a number example, here's the syntax for the do while loop. The keyword do is used to start the statement. Curly braces are used to hold the code block. After the code block is the keyword while. Inside the parentheses is a condition. If the condition is true, the code block will be executed again. If the condition is false, the code block will exit and the loop ends. Inside the code block can be one to many lines of code. It is recommended to keep the number of lines low. In this example, you will guess a number. The result of that guess will be given, correct, higher, or lower. If my number is not equal to your number, the code block is executed again. This happens until my number is equal to your number. As you can see, the number of times the code block is executed is an unknown number. This is the primary reason for a do while or while loop. Let me explain the difference between the do while and the while loop. The do while loop has a condition after the code block. The while loop has a condition before the code block. The do while code block will always execute one time. It is possible for the while code block to not be executed at all. Sure, here's the syntax for a while loop. The keyword while starts the statement. Inside the parentheses is a condition. If the condition is true, the code block will execute. If the condition is false, the code block will not execute and the loop ends. After the parentheses are curly braces that contain the code block that will be executed. Let me show both the do while and while statements. Notice the do while loop has a condition after the code block, and the while loop has a condition before the code block. The do loop will always execute the code block one time. The while loop may or may not execute the code block. Should the code block always be executed one time? In a hockey playoff game, there could be 0 to many overtime periods. What if there was a loop that processes code for each overtime period? What happens if the game is not tied at the end of regulation? The code block will execute the overtime code which is not intended. Since it is possible no overtime period is needed, using a while loop allows for 0 executions of the code block. A do loop would not be the right choice. Depending on your situation, you have options. Time for a Coach Joe challenge question. Looking at this do loop, do you see a problem with this statement? Correct, this is an infinite loop. The condition is always true. The loop has no way of producing a false condition, therefore it will run forever. Use caution when creating loops. Make sure there's a way for the loop to exit. The break and continue commands are allowed in the do while and while loop. Even though these commands are allowed, you should limit their use. Let's cover the break command. During the execution of the code block, you may decide the loop should end. The break command will stop the loop. There are situations when a break is a valid exit option. The other command is continue. During the execution of the code block, you may decide to stop processing code for this iteration of the loop. The continue command will exit the code block and the while condition is tested again. If the condition is true, the code block will be executed again. The continue statement does allow code block execution options. However, it's an indication of poorly designed code. Without going into too many details now, the continue statement violates many Coach Joe rules that will be covered in future lessons. For now, see if you can find a way to avoid this statement. Let's go to our Basics project in IntelliJ, close any open class tabs. Let's navigate or create a new test package called Loops. Inside of there, let's create a new class. Let's call it doTest. Let's make some space, copy in this first test, import these classes. The first test will show the number guess example with the do-while loop. Here are two variables used for my number and your number. Here is the do-while loop. Inside the code block, your number is incremented by 1. The assert statement will verify your number is 4. If we run this test, it passes. This test will show a while loop that executes the code block. Here are two variables used to hold the current hockey period and the intermission count. Here is the while loop. The condition will execute the code block if the hockey period is less than 3. Inside the code block, the intermission count and hockey period are incremented by 1. The assert will verify the intermission count is 2. If we run this test, it passes. This test will show a while loop where the code block is not executed. Here are three variables used to hold the overtime count, visitor team score, and home team score. Here is the while loop. The condition will execute the code block if the visitor team score equals the home team score. This condition is false. If the code block is called, the overtime count will be incremented. The assert will verify the overtime count is 0. The code block was never executed. If we run this test, it passes. This test will show the condition for a do-while is false from the beginning, but the code block will be executed one time. Here are the three variables used to hold the overtime count, visitor team score, and home team score. Here is the do-while loop. Inside the code block, the overtime count and home team score are incremented. The assert will verify the overtime count is 1. Notice that the while condition is not true at the beginning of the loop, but the code block is executed one time. And if we run this test, it passes. This test will show the break statement in a do-while loop. Here is a variable that holds the loop count. This is the do loop. Inside the code block is an if statement that calls the break if the loop count is equal to 4. The condition will keep executing the code block if the loop count is less than 10. The assert will verify the loop count is 4. Let's run this test. And it passes. Notice the output shows 1, 2, 3, and 4. This proves the break caused the loop to end. This final test will show a continue statement in a do-while loop. Here's a variable that holds the loop count. This is the do loop. Inside the code block is an if statement that calls the continue statement if the loop count is a multiple of 3. The condition will keep executing the code block if the loop count is less than 10. Let's see the output of this test. Notice the values 3, 6, and 9 do not appear in the output. Here's a summary of all the test code we wrote for this lesson. Which loop should we use? Let's do a quick review of all the looping options. The standard for loop is used when you know exactly how many times you need to execute a block of code. Typically, this situation happens less than 10% of the time. Coach Joe Rule 32 states, the use of a standard for loop may be an indication of poorly designed code. It is acceptable to use the standard for loop when you know exactly how many times you need to execute a block of code, or if you are demonstrating a non-production idea. Don't use this for loop for collections. The enhanced for loop is used when you need to iterate over a collection like an array, arrayless, set, or map. This will be a very common looping situation. Coach Joe Rule number 33 states, use the enhanced for loop when iterating through a collection. The do, while, and while loops are used when you don't know the exact number of times a code block will be executed. These two loops are infrequently used. Coach Joe Rule 17 states, avoid using the do, while, and while loops. Use the do, while, or while loop when you don't know the exact number of iterations that will occur. It's not for collections. Beware of infinite loop situations. You should now have an understanding of the do, while, and while loops, including the syntax and code examples. Use of the do, while, and while loop is meant for those situations when you don't know the exact number of times a block of code will be executed. In the next lesson, we'll discuss the enum. Remember, future senior developers, make it work, prove it works, then make it better. Ready?
Break!